Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
He still sounds surprised whenever we do this. Actually, I'm gonna stop during the intro, everyone. This is really unkind. So today, and we have a guest, and we'll introduce where our guest is today. But Gareth is on one of his trips. However, Gareth, while you're in Canada, we've had episodes where we've been in Canada before. Gareth, what's the most direct route you can imagine to get to Canada from Oxfordshire? Just to check. And when did you arrive in Canada? Let's start with those things.
Yeah. So obviously the most direct route would be to take a flight from London to Toronto, because that's where I'm working. But I wouldn't want to do that. So due to Air Canada strike action, I found myself having to fly to Canada via Athens and Cairo. And for anybody who knows their geography, that means you fly for several hours in the wrong direction before doing a U-turn and coming back. So what was supposed to be an 8 hour ended up taking me about 22 hours. 15 hours into it, I checked that online sort of map of where your plane is through the journey, only to find that 15 hours in, I was right over London, basically where I'd started. Well, that was somewhat frustrating. But 22 hours later, I've slept a little bit on the plane, and here I am in Ontario.
Don't anyone listening feel sorry for him. He's just showing off about all the glamorous places he gets to go to. But in honor of the fact that you've literally just arrived after what sounds like quite a tricky journey, we'll cut you a little bit of slack today. But anyway, back to the intro, everyone. In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business as we compare and contrast our experiences and attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And today, we are very, very pleased to have a guest, and particularly because this has taken a little bit of time for us to all get our calendars to align, even if we are in Canada. Gareth, would you like to briefly introduce our guest, because you found our guest?
Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted. We have Damian O'Doherty, who, when I first left the Royal Marines coming up 8 years ago, I did a sort of transition out of the military course where we learned a whole load of new skills, but also talked about how some of the leadership and management skills that we developed in our careers within the military could be translated into the commercial world. And it's called the Advanced Management Achievement Course, and I did it with Manchester Business School, and that's where I came across Damian, who is an academic. We're going to learn all about that in a moment. And he gave us a really interesting after dinner speech about the anthropology of leadership. And then from that, Damien and I ended up having a range of discussions. And for a brief period of time, I explored the idea of doing a PhD, and Damien was going to be my supervisor doing that. So for a couple of years, we had a back and forth before I realised that I was busy enough with all the other stuff that I have going on, and doing a PhD on the top of it was probably not the best idea. So yeah, we have Damien here to give us a sort of a real academic view of everything we talk about rather than our pseudoscience.
And I'll just before we say hello to Damien proper, I always feel bad about this with our guests sort of sit patiently and wait for the end of this. But I'll give you a little bit of Damien's bio, because I think it's important to know where he comes from and his background. Professor Damian O'Doherty is a professor of management and organisation at the University of Liverpool and an internationally recognised researcher in the fields of leadership, organisational culture and critical management studies. He's known for pioneering ethnographic approaches to studying work, and he has held senior academic positions at the University of Manchester and Copenhagen Business School. Damien's work explores the complex and often messy realities of how organisations function, far beyond spreadsheets and strategy, drawing on philosophy, anthropology, and the social studies of science. And his recent research spans alternative forms of organising across farming, policy, and climate resilience, challenging traditional assumptions about leadership and power. And rather than just sort of doing all of that, which I presume is a pretty full-time work, he's also the author of Reconstructing Organisation, The Loungification of Society, and serves on the editorial boards of leading journals, including Organisation and the Academy of Management, Learning and Education. So this is one of those guests where I get really nervous because there is someone who patently knows a lot more than me about these things. And therefore, I hope myself and Gareth were on our toes. But after all of that, Damian, welcome. And thank you very much for joining us on Battling with Business.
Thank you for the invite. Delighted to join you.
So I've got to start. As I went through, so Gareth introduced me to you, and obviously I went away and thought, well, Gareth's usually pretty good about the guests he brings on the podcast. And I did a tiny amount of research. And just as you heard in that introduction, you talk about reconstructing organization and the loungification of society. I have to start by getting you to explain what that means and also the implications for how we think about leadership and how people do work today.
So yeah, that's a direct question, a very good one. It forces me to be direct in my answers. So reconstructing organization signals to many different audiences. It wasn't my original title for the book. This was the outcome of extended conversations with my publisher, who didn't want really the loungification of society as the title because it couldn't be located within any particular genre or discipline of business or management studies, and they feared a readership. So something like reconstructing organization sounded to the publisher as if it would attract the right readership. And so let's just say it took some persuasion, but I went with that on the proviso that I could have my title as the subtitle. So you've got reconstructing organization, and the subtitle is then the loungification of society. So reconstructing, that gestures makes a reference to what's been going on in academia for about 30 years in my specialist field called deconstruction. And we've deconstructed the hell out of modern organization. Now, it's a lot of principles attached to what we call modern organizations. But just briefly for today's conversation, we can identify a couple of things that distinguish modern organizations. They're either bureaucratic or Taylorist. They're usually centralized and hierarchical, and they're built on the premise of growth, science, optimism, hope, and a future. What comes after modernity or modernism is something that a lot of academics started calling postmodernism about 30 years ago. And that kind of inverted the principles of modern organizations and said that postmodern organizations would be lateral, decentralized, fragmented, just in time, a bit like Gareth's mindset after his trip around the world to get to Canada. He's distributed in time and space, and we're lucky to have him here in one whole person. So that was modern and postmodern. And under postmodernism, academics had gone about what we call deconstructing organizations, taking them apart. We call them hierarchies, but they're not really, because every hierarchy has resistance and subversion. It wouldn't exist without subversion and resistance. There's tensions which pull organizations to centralize and to decentralize. Chaos and disorder are just as much the reality as spreadsheets, order, control. So after myself participating in this world for 30 years, I thought, well, we've deconstructed the hell out of it. What are we going to do with it now going forward? How do we address, big challenges like climate change? Well, maybe we need to now reconstruct organization from ground zero. So that was a little bit of a tease in the title, lots of references, plays going on, wide readership, specialist readership, and then the subtitle, which we might come on to a little later, the loungification of society.
Okay, I'm not going to let you get away with. We'll come on to that later. Actually, I'm going to. One of the things that I enjoy about this is I get to be the idiot on this in my own safe space. You talked about the move from modern organizations to postmodern organizations. That indicates whether it be a spectrum, but a shift from one way to another. What is it that either identifies this shift or is even causing this shift? Because that we talked a couple of weeks ago about Mary Follett Parker, and that was really interesting as she talked about this idea moving from sort of the mechanistic approach to a human approach. This seems to be sort of, in its own way, a similar kind of shift in paradigms. What's caused this?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's being debated, and there are many, many competing versions of this. Some see it as a shift in the 20th century after 1945. Some people periodize it. Modernism existed up until about 1918, maybe. People realized that the 20th century was going to be a brutal and destructive period of time. Some people date it to the 1870s. So there's periodization debates. Something shifts. Some people identify as 1973, the birth of monetarism, the decline of Keynesianism, if you're familiar with those approaches to modern economics. A shift from the state as a kind of welfare from cradle to grave, support for collectives, for society, to one based on contractual individualist notions, where the state doesn't take quite the active form of intervention it has taken in the 20th century. That might be another way that academics and commentators periodize this shift from one period in time, modernity, to an emerging period of time of postmodernity.
And do you see artifacts that reflect that in the way we think about organization and management as well?
Yeah, so it's complex because it's both a different way of looking at the world, which you might call methodological, or a fancier word that people like to use in academia, an epistemology, how to get to know the world out there, quantitatively or qualitatively. There are different ways of approaching it. Depends, for example, on the phenomena. So what's the best way of approaching love? 70% of men have experienced love in their lifetime. Does it tell you much about love, or do you need your, kind of Provençal poets to write about love for you to acquire a sense of it through poetic means or artistic means? So it depends on the phenomena you're studying, what the method is to study. So that's one shift, that people look at the world very differently these days. And the second shift is what people would call the nature of reality in and of itself, irrespective of how you look at it. So that, in a fancy word, would be ontology, the nature of being, the nature of reality. And some people argue that it's a shift in that, reality has changed now. We're not in the same reality as we were in 1930 or 1870, 1830. We are in a very different reality. And, a crude and approximate way of differentiating that was to say that there was a shift somewhere in the 20th century where we popped out of modernity and something new started to come about called postmodernity. And both those things are at play. There's both way of looking at the world and the world in and of itself. And then, of course, the clever people show how those two are entangled together anyway.
So maybe that actually does lead us neatly back to loungification of society. Tell me what you mean by the loungification of society.
So this came late in the research. It wasn't something I went out to study or look at. And we can talk about ethnography, which is the kind of approach I take to management studies. But I joined Manchester Airport in 2009, and I stayed there full time for 18 months. And then I went into a 4-day week and then a 3 or 2 day week up until April 2012, which is naive as an ethnographer, because you just come away with, I think I had 2 or 3 filing cabinets, 4 lever arch filing cabinets of materials. And I was intending to write a book about the airport, but the airport was just too big to write a book about. So I just picked one project that I'd followed in that airport, which was the development of a departure lounge. Quite a novel departure lounge, because it was being organised by the airport and funded by the airport, not by one of the airlines. So it was quite novel. The airport had never made a lounge in the past before. Did it have the skills? Did it have the expertise? Did it have the project managers? All these questions were live on this project. And so I just picked the files out that I had on that. And that was enough to manage and synthesize and to analyze and justified a book. And in fact, Loungification was a kind of play as well, because I was studying the making of loungers, and I wanted to kind of stoke up a kind of a little interest in the question, are we all becoming loungers? Is that what I am now? I'm defined as a lounger. And, good or bad. I didn't know whether it was a good or bad thing to be defined as a lounger. But it seemed to provoke a reaction. So a lot of academics had written big kind of treatises on things like the McDonaldization of society. Everything is becoming McDonald's. You can imagine education is becoming McDonald's. Maybe military supply chains, I don't know, Gareth could talk about this, are becoming McDonaldized. Or another trope that was doing the rounds at the time was the Disneyfication of society, which also kind of resonates. You think, yeah, get that? Entertaining ourselves to death. That's, kind of a trope maybe. So playing on that a little bit cheekily, I devised this term loungification, in a way to make a little mockery of those big grandiose theses that the whole world is changing in the mirror image of McDonald's. And I wanted to both kind of play on that, but suggest that something more trivial might be happening. You might call it the trivialization of sociality, the trivialization of organization, of people's preoccupations. I was particularly taken with this phrase. I can't remember now who first coined it. The surname is Ngai, Ngai, and she's a literary theorist in America. And I misquote her all the time, but my misquote is insightful. She talks about stuplimity. So she's talking about the rise in popular culture of Beavis and Butthead culture. If you remember that, you might be as old as I am to remember Beavis and Butthead. But some of the Simpsons would be another one, where there's this knowing engagement, ironically, with something which is apparently stupid, but it says intelligent things through that stupidity. So how do we coin a phrase for that complicity with stupidity in a knowing way? So stuplicity or stuplimity, which played on the notion of the sublime stupid. And from Erasmus on in modern knowledge systems, there has been this reverence for the idiot fool, the wise fool, the shaman fool. So playing on that a little bit with duplicity and stuplimity led me to think about the lounger and an unorchestrated loungification of society. So playing on those conspiracy theories, we're all being dumbed down and made to be stupid. That's what society is doing to us. Just some of the ideas there, Chris, that were circulating around my thinking towards the end of the research to try to get a handle on what the airport project managers, construction teams, marketing teams might be in a bigger scheme of things complicit in.
I was going to say, how do you connect those two things? We started by talking about reconstructing organization and saying, what does the modern organization mean? What does it look like, this postmodern organizational structure? And you've talked about the loungification. How do you connect those two? What's 1 + 1 = 2 of this? What are the implications?
I think in postmodernism, 1 + 1 = yellow. So as I said, I didn't expect to find this, and I wasn't looking for it when I went out to do the research. And it may have been the myopia of my own focus on this one project, but suddenly I started to see lounges everywhere. And I wager once you've thought about this for a little while, you'll start to see them everywhere as well. My high street bank has turned into a lounge. My library is turning into a learning lounge. This is also a domestic. People have lounges, which is a very American term. We used to have sitting rooms, if you remember. Our parents might have talked about sitting rooms, but it's gradually become, I think, much more common to talk about where you put your TV or you spend a lot of time not working to be the lounge of the house. But then the lounge, of course, is also a public space, hotel lobby lounges, lounge lizards, piano bars. There was a great fear about the lounge, actually. Historians show us in the growth of commercial hotels in city centres in America in the 1930s, a lot of people started to get worried about loungers. They were kind of a sexually liberated and loose group of people coming on and coming onto the scene, and we weren't quite clear what it was like to enter these rather disreputable lounges. How does one behave in a lounge? And what's the appropriate clothing to wear? There were new spaces, and sociologists got very concerned about that in the 1930s, which died down a little bit. So I started to see the lounge in the airport not just as a kind of prestige executive product that certain kind of a strata of customers passing through an airport would want to buy, the lounge experience. It was also a way of managing, to manage with a kind of affectation, let's say, of casualness, of maybe what academics might have called the sprezzatura, with effortless grace, to manage with effortless grace, to lounge the way through the day, casualization of clothing, of language. So all these things, I think, could be wrapped up in this term, the loungification.
So I'm as with all these conversations, I get all excited with 1,000 questions. The loungification of management, which feels very familiar, which is relaxed, which is effortless, which is confident, which is desirable. What I found is when you use those words in almost any context, it's never effortless. It's never relaxed. In other words, to create a lounge in an airport is a highly technical, precise activity where there are far more opportunities to get it wrong and create a terrible experience than there are to get it right. So how do you see, when you talk about the loungification of management in that respect, how do you see that juxtaposed with people being ruthless managers who have to organize? Because I think that's how people would see. I can imagine people saying, oh, this is sort of a very hippie way of thinking about things. When the reality is, I suspect underneath the surface, like the proverbial swan, they're paddling like crazy. So talk to me about that. I don't think you're suggesting that nobody cares. They're sitting there with their cigarettes in their hand or ring. Talk to me about that relationship.
No, that's absolutely right. Of course, it's not, and it's the contradictions that I was after. This performance of effortless grace. As you say, below the surface, those legs are kind of struggling to keep you buoyant. And I think that's a very insightful account of what it is to be a manager. I should say something about the manager as a kind of trope as well. The manager is a kind of go-to figure. The manager is, since the Quaker firms in Britain, management has been seen as the savior of capitalism, in fact. You could turn to socialism, you could turn to communism, you could turn to fascism to resolve this contradiction between the rising wealth of the capitalist class and the immiseration of a working class. Many people say this is eventually going to come towards a kind of collision and a clash, and a new society is going to be born out of it. Well, Britain found a middle way. Keynesianism is part of that. We mentioned that earlier. And managers could save us. Good management could bring and hold an organization together. So the manager is a figure of hope, but it's full of contradictions, managing contradictions. It's as an individual manager managing their own contradictions. And these are very, very challenging, difficult things. And our best universities don't prepare students for those roles. They tell them how to calculate net present value 24 times, but they don't really teach you how to inhabit the figure of a manager.
Is that because as we talk about sort of the modernist approach to these things and the Taylorism, and it's about precision and it's about managing a system that is akin to a machine, and in the postmodernist system it's about managing an organic system that's more the cultivation, we're drifting away from the concept of the traditional manager and thinking far more about the leader, and it's
Yeah.
about people. And is that then where the sort of performance of effortless grace, as you described it, becomes really important, because it's about instilling confidence in those people that are being managed? Because it's more of a leadership, lead by example thing, rather than the technocratic management.
Yeah, no, that's a very yeah, I think that will resonate with a lot of people, Gareth, that distinction. Another way of looking at is that the the separation between the mechanistic and the organic is an artificial one. So the more you, and we knew this in modernity, the more you seek precision and order, the more disorder that will be created out of that, what economists call externalities, which is that
Yeah.
we won't look at, right? They don't figure in our calculations, but they inevitably, like you push down here, on the balloon, it will pop out somewhere else. So, every effort to order creates its equal and opposite reaction, which is disorder, displaced into, strange places which we might not necessarily have the measuring tools to capture. Which is why ethnography, I think, is quite an interesting method, because it allows you to dig around and find those. So for every precision project that I followed, it was inevitably mired in chaos and disorder, to the point at which you started to think the two required each other.
So, with a complete lack of performance of effortless grace, I'm going to try and shoehorn in the conversation around military leadership and management. We talk a lot on this podcast about the value of the concept of mission command, which clearly comes from the German Auftragtaktik kind of concept of decentralizing decision making to enable the overall order of the system to respond to those externalities. So locally, commanders, leaders, managers, whatever you want to call them, can make decisions based on their local externalities. And that's a way of sort of harnessing that chaos. In the military at the moment, there's a lot of conversation about the role of the leader as a leading by example. That's clearly, always a discussion about the role of the leader to be the example to the followers, but also in this idea of being honest to the point of exposing what you can't do. And there's a lot of discussion around toxicity and toxic leadership, and I wonder whether this lounge concept of allowing people to sit around in a more relaxed way and think about complex problems is another example of that. But of course, there are times where that doesn't work, and actually you need the order and structure to move through the chaos of the current situation. Is that? Do you think these things are related?
Well, I'm not. I'm certainly not advocating loungification as a management strategy, but then I think maybe my research leads to a different insight about leadership. Leadership are often the public face, there to account for what's happening in an organization as well. People these days talk about leader proofing organizations. In other words, making sure that that person elected as leader doesn't fall for the PR stunt of what a leader is, and doesn't go around trying to knock the organization into a transformation program, an 18-month transformation program, top down, led by a kind of charismatic transformational leader. The research shows that tends to end up with more chaos than it trying to combat. So now we talk about leader-proofing organizations, people into bureaucracy making a comeback. Outstanding scholars like Paul Duguay have been, kind of very unfashionable for about 30 years, in fact, despite the quality of their scholarship, were unpopular because they were pushing back against what they saw as this rising tide of fascination for the post-bureaucratic, the disordered, the chaotic. They thought this was all, well, Paul and his colleagues all thought this was just fashion gone out of hand in management schools. And what we're seeing now is a pushback saying, there were certain things that bureaucracy has, which are absolutely essential in modern democratic, liberal, pluralist societies. You can't just get rid of them, and they're impossible to get rid of, and they actually help provide steerage, ethical forms of management, and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I mean, I see that as well.
I love the term leader proofing or leadership proofing, because it's a really interesting contrary idea. My sense, and this is such an interesting conversation, because there's the mechanics of leadership and management, and there's the interplay of the perception and all these other factors that play a part but are sometimes quite intangible. Heroes. There's something about leaders that we want leaders to be heroes. And whether it be, and I'm going to use the word poorly, managers and leaders, but if you could tap into people's real feelings and you said, do you want a hero or do you not want a hero? Everyone wants a hero. This is, the Elon Musk of the organization. He's a hero. We need people like that who can motivate people. What do you think is this role of hero? And I think you've already started talking about it. How do you think it's changing? Because that's fascinating, the idea that maybe people are pushing back on this idea of hero, and that maybe it's counterproductive in times, which I think when you talked about, Gareth, toxic leadership, it's often the hero that's gone too far and that's ceased to be useful. I don't know. What's your thinking on this idea of heroism and leadership and management?
Well, the Greek myths have taught us that the hubris of the human, hubris, the humus, the human from the earth, that aspires to the status of a god is going to, meet a very tricky end. Every star, every hero has a second half of their life in which they're discredited. And, I think Elon Musk is on the cusp of that right now in many ways. The reputation of many chief executive officers, have their ascendancy and the rise and then their fall. And they say this is a peculiarly British kind of phenomena. We raise a star up to hero and then we, kind of dismantle them and they end up with a breakdown for another form of media spectacle. Hero and then villain. And you can't have one without the other. And often they are brought into the same person, aren't they?
As you've even described it, though, the question was almost framed in, and I didn't put it this way, should we be making our leaders and managers less heroic? And I almost think you've said we almost can't help ourselves. Yeah. We are doomed to say that person in charge has to be a hero, so we're going to make you a hero or not. Is there a way of us sort of reversing this? Because the statement that we're starting, and I don't know, I'm seeing this, so I'm being optimistic that you're right. This idea that bureaucracy is having a comeback. We had a whole episode where we defended bureaucracy, good bureaucracy, because they can be bad. Do you really think it's coming back? Because that seems contrary to what I experience every day. As I say, everyone wants their heroes. We've got Michael Gove saying, I think we've had enough of the experts. And, the good old tradition grafting and working hard and becoming skilled seems less valuable these days. Are you seeing the opposite or seeing a change in that?
I was thinking more about the revival of interest in bureaucracy as a mode of organization, not whether it's happening or not. I think the academic debate has, swings, there's fads and fashions in academia. And we've had this fad and fashion for disorder and postmodernism for 30 years. But just recently, people are pushing back against that. And there's a return to, well, what if, what are we going to lose if bureaucracy has, disappeared? What you don't know what you've got till it's gone, right?
Well, I was about to say, I mean, we occasionally, unfortunately, verge into the more political thing, but I think right now we're in a living experiment where I think we have a risk of finding out what happens if you throw away your bureaucracy and say this stuff. Let's take a quick break. About 20 minutes ago, you touched on your ethnographic approach, and as the resident idiot, I would love for you to talk about, first of all, what is an ethnographic approach and what have you learned and what's different. So let's come back after the break and let's talk about ethnography. I did not think that was going to be one of my phrases in Battling with Business, but let's come back straight after this. Welcome back. Oh, the idea that bureaucracy might have value warms the cockles of my heart. And maybe it's this balance. Maybe we have to talk about balance later on, because that always seems to be interesting. But let's go back to that question about ethnographic approach. So this is, I think, one of the big ways that you think about your investigation, and you talked about it at Manchester Airport. Let's start with the basics. What is an ethnographic approach? What does that mean, and how is that different from other approaches?
So I have a very pithy and succinct definition of it, which probably needs a bit of unpacking. But essentially, to start with the conclusion, an ethnographer becomes a somewhat useful member of society that they are studying, a competent member. They can pass as a member of the society they are trying to study.
Wow, that is about as simple as it gets. I mean, the point being, you went and worked for Manchester Airport. You participated and worked there. So you are now one of them. You're a member of the tribe. You speak their language. You understand their habits and their artifacts and their behaviors. What is it that perhaps others might miss, or indeed have missed? What did you learn being a part of that organization that either surprised you or might surprise others?
Well, the first thing I should say is that I learned that my host was a better ethnographer than I was. And it took me a lot of learning to get to that point, really. The guy that, let's say, let me in, but that's another whole complicated story full of things I might not want to confess publicly. The guy that let me in and hosted was a brilliant young executive at the airport. Controversial in some ways, very young. I think the youngest by a general, nearly like 10 years maybe, to serve on the executive board. And I was very close, and I studied him day in, day out. And this moment I can explain came to me. It was a moment. People talk about ethnographic moments. And this was a moment for me about 6 months in, where I'd been desperate to try and find an organizational chart to tell me whereabouts am I in who reports to who. And, you know, who does Jim work for, and who does Valerie work for, and where are we in these kind of maps? And I couldn't find one. And no, everybody kind of got a bit funny with me when I started asking about them. Yeah, you need to speak to Jim. I think Jim has one of them. Of course, Jim doesn't have one. No, I haven't had one for a while. People seem to operate without these charts. I am the postmodern organization theorists who, for 20 years, has dissed the idea that maps tell you anything about organization. And there I am, desperate to find one, pulling my hair out. How can I work in this organization without a chart? And I finally did find one. I got one, and I brought it down to show my host. I said, "Look, I found an organizational chart. Look, here you are. I can find you on here." And he laughed. He laughed at this chart, and he said, "That's not the way it works. Look here." And he deconstructed this chart for me, and he showed me the holes in it. He showed me this person here, in fact, died. The name of a dead person was in one of those coffin-like boxes. This part of the organization wasn't connected to that, as the map suggested. This part was to be constructed. So he read it as a kind of claim for representation of the organization. And he challenged it, and he showed me many different ways of interpreting that artifact as a chart of the organization. And it was about this time I realized, God, you are a better ethnographer than I am. He wouldn't call himself that. And he wasn't really, because an ethnographer can never be fully a part of the organization they're studying. They do have to get out of it at some stage. Yeah. If you go native and you forget you've gone native, as many do, in fact, in this profession, many ethnographers don't remember who they were when they went into the field site and forget to come back. They don't. The question doesn't even occur to them. Many cases of that.
So I've got to ask about the org structure, because as a person who's worked in corporate organizations for the last 30 years of my life, I have participated in them, and then more latterly in my career helped build them and decide what do we look like, where do we go. I'm smiling, and I probably shouldn't be. The struggle you seem to be having, that it's both a terrible thing and a magical thing. It's both a complete thing and an incomplete thing. It tells you everything and it tells you nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing for me is the question you were asking was a three-dimensional question, where literally seeing that this person reports to this person in this division tells you a tiny piece of information, but it doesn't tell you the relationship. Talk to me more about your newfound fear and love of organizational structures, because I think that as an ethnographer, that's really interesting, that as someone who might have said this is all ridiculous because it's all based on, currency of experience and things like that, feels like you're having a bit of a schizophrenic moment here where you don't know whether to argue yourself or not.
Oh, yeah. No, I think schizophrenia is a condition of management. It's a job requirement. I think in many ways people say, well, I've got my private life and my public life. That's a schizophrenic split. We don't like those worlds often to meet. They cause discomfort. So, yeah, no, schizophrenia. I was talking about the ethnographers that couldn't get out of their organization. There's a tragic case of an ethnographer that wanted to study a psychiatric ward in a hospital, and then came to the end of the 12-month study and said, I want to go back to university now. I think my results I've got my results. My work here is complete. And of course, the director of the Psychiatric Institute goes, interesting you say that.
There's a lesson for us all there in terms of management investigation.
Yeah. Sorry, I digressed from your question, Chris. That was about the schizophrenia, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was about this idea that as an academic, you had a very clear perspective about organizational structure and how that's represented and what the real meaning is. And you just come and told us a story that you were desperate to find an org chart.
Yeah. Yeah.
What now you've stepped out. Now, what's your opinion about organizational structure, both in terms of how it's represented, but perhaps more importantly, what it actually means? What did you learn?
Well, the smart consultant asks what are the results that the senior executive commissioning the research wants to find. And I mean, that's a cynical answer in some ways, and I don't believe it's that simple. But I guess the learning I went through, Chris, was one of disembodied cognitive understanding, book learning in libraries and books about structure and hierarchy. But as an embodied, passionate, living human subject, I discovered that I craved that when I went out into the airport and experienced disorder and chaos. I wasn't quite as cool as I might have thought I was. I wanted structure. I wanted lines of responsibility. I wanted to, in part, just to know who would hold me accountable for what I'm doing. Who do I need to respect?
How did you resolve this? The extremes are, I want everything documented. I want a clear matrix of my roles and responsibilities and accountability. And at the other end, there is I don't want any of that. We'll work it out as we go. We're a flat structure. Where did you kind of land in the middle then? A better way of saying it? If I came to you and said, I have just inherited an organization with 500 people, I want to come to you and ask for your wisdom on how should I represent my structure? Where did you land?
Let me try and answer that. It's a really difficult question. I made lots of mistakes, Chris, and if many people in the airport could have had their way, I would have been out of the door within about a week or two. So the problem was they couldn't locate me. Who was he? Who was he working for? And my sponsor had to say, well, he's not really working for anyone. He's paid by the university. He's a full-time researcher, and I had a conversation with him one day, and we seemed to hit it off, and I was grappling with things in my role that I thought he might be able to answer. only hasn't yet, but ethnography is quite slow. I'm hoping for something in 12 months. The press got hold of this. It was spread out over the Daily Mail. I think I had a running column for one time upsetting the British Taxpayers Alliance because they thought this was a terrible waste of money that an academic was spending a year inside an airport, because you just had to watch the Tom Cruise film about the man in the airport to understand what it's like to be in an airport. So there was a lot of stuff going on around this time that I was hankering after the map, hankering after the chart, discovering that my so-called informant was actually a better ethnographer than dealing with these charts and maps. And yes, I made lots of mistakes, and the way I found myself wasn't in between two kind of bookends of a polarity. I think it was somewhere outside of that frame of reference, because to understand it as a separation, as you did just then, on the left hand you got this, on the right hand you've got this, you've got somewhere outside of that looking down on it, an abstraction or a transcendental point. Now, I'm not claiming to have transcended anything, but I became a lot more circumspect about the terms that we use, these very polarity or dualistic terms in which to understand organizations, either structure or chaos.
So a lot of what we've been talking about is focused around the individual manager or leader and their effect on the organization. And we've been talking about different types of organization, the structured, bureaucratic, or the free-flowing, flat, unstructured. There's a concept that is very military, and we talk about on this podcast a lot because of the nature of this podcast, which is the concept of command, where management is about the resourcing of things, people, money, time. Leadership is about persuading people, and it's about relationships. Command is not an individual thing at all. It's about the relationship between people of various management and leadership positions. And we talk about it very definitionally in the military as being the balance of accountability, responsibility, and authority. And I think when you say you transcended or looked at it from a transcendental sort of position, would it be fair to say that you're starting to then look at the relationships between various leaders and managers and their role within organizations? And is that akin to how the military looks at command and is very, very flexible? So I think there's a misconception about the military that we are a very bureaucratic, everything's done by drills and orders, and everybody knows what they're doing all the time. But the reality is we're large bureaucratic organizations facing very complex and dynamic situations, and therefore we have to have an ability to be flexible and agile in the way that we organize ourselves. And command is the way that we do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of points to answer that, Gareth. I mean, have you ever met somebody who is fully able to separate themselves out personally from the role that they occupy, the position they occupy? Yeah, that
No.
seems, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're going to reach a point at which that gets confused and you don't know how you're going to respond in particular situations. So I've never been in the military, although my father was in the Air Force I don't know if I shared this with you. My father was in the Air Force for the first 12 years of my life. So I was brought up on Air Force bases as an Air Force kid, moved around every 3 years. So at some embodied level, I think I have an insight into kind of hierarchies, authority, seniority, deference, respect, saluting, that whole uniforms. I have an embodied history there. But when I read Tolstoy's War and Peace, you've probably heard this many times because it's the classic case. People who have been in war situations tell me Tolstoy gets it absolutely right, that what happens on the battlefield is a million miles away from the planning room, and often it's sheer luck, an accident and chance that gets one through that, or not. all the best laid plans, and it's a very disturbing book for people who have been brought up on modern organization theory, because the military is the classic example of the ideal type of a hierarchy that works like a machine. And you're right, it doesn't work like that. But if something like, if Tolstoy is right, something much darker and worrying is at play in the conduct of war.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is what, Clausewitz calls the fog of war, the friction. It's what you referred to earlier as externalities.
Yeah.
And I think the only difference between leadership and management in war and combat and leadership and management of a commercial organization or a political organization or anything else really is that dial of luck, and the consequences of that are dialed up to 11, to take a Spinal Tap reference. And I think that's where perhaps the military has gone through this evolution of command and leadership theory to land upon this mission command concept, which is to acknowledge those externalities, to acknowledge the role of luck and the friction and Murphy's law. When things go wrong, they will always go wrong at the worst possible moment, and all of that kind of stuff, and build that into your management structures, and to build in a level of flexibility. And I don't know whether I'm just incredibly biased in my education and experience, but it just feels that when we're trying to find that balance between the right level of bureaucracy, but also the right level of flexibility and agility, decentralization makes sense, but it's decentralizing from an organized structure.
I mean, Damian, just to test what you were saying, I'm not going to try and put words in your mouth now after saying I'm going to test what you're saying. I don't think you're implying it doesn't really matter because everything comes down to luck.
No.
I think you were saying that is something that we choose not to talk about very much because it's quite worrying. This is, I've spent all my life learning and building experience and learning tricks. And it turns out that there's a solid 25% where literally you roll the dice. I don't want to consider that. And that actually it is, as you said, Gareth, it is all about trying to, can I squeeze that 25% down to 20% of luck? How do I squeeze that more? I almost want to go back actually to the beginning, Damian, of something you said, because I think it's such a fascinating idea, which is the more ordered you try to make something, the more chaotic it becomes. That's something which lots of people through my career have both laughed at me or rolled their eyes at me because I described myself as the insurance guy. And what I mean by that is I try to find the balance. The balance seems to be the place I want to be because it's sort of the mid. This idea of for you to reduce risk and reduce complexity, the more you make it. It seems to be almost getting at this idea of finding equilibrium somewhere in the middle. I don't know. That's me making it up. Talk a bit more about this. The more you try to order, the more likely you are to create greater externalities which almost defeat the order and vice versa.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a very simple way, I think your listeners might grasp this intuitively. Anything that you pay attention to for any period of time becomes more complex. The more attention I paid to an aeroplane, the more miraculous it seemed that aeroplane took off and landed safely, the more I knew about it. So I was on an A380 in the cockpit one time, and there were two engineers, an Arabic engineer and a French engineer, and they both had manuals for this aircraft which were out on their laps. One was in French and one was in Arabic. And the dashboard, well, I not technically, the dashboards were all off, the fascias were all off the units, and like spaghetti junction was falling out of them. And they've got all these wires out and they're trying to translate from Arabic to French about something about what was missing there. And they only had 15 minutes before they started to board the aircraft. So they were trying to do it quick. And they just basically shoved all the wires back in, screwed it up, and it'll be all right. And I later subsequently found out that there's a very, very strong paradigm, incommensurable debate in flight engineering, that there are two ways of explaining what keeps an aeroplane in the air. They both can't be right. So, I've explained that probably badly. You'll have people on this show that can explain that a lot more. But that, for a moment, when I was sat in that cockpit, I thought, Jesus, is this thing safe? Well, of course, we know it's the safest way to travel. But on the other hand, we can't answer the basic question. Well, what keeps the airplane in the sky? So you've got half the engineers saying this and half the engineers saying this.
So and I know this is sort of a theoretical, but it gets back to how do you find your equilibrium? In that simple case, how much do you want to know about aeroplanes?
Well, I
mean that, and I mean that almost quite genuinely, which is you now have said I was in a moment of ignorance and this thing was simple and I didn't worry about it.
Yeah.
I had a moment of knowledge and now I worry about it more. Yeah. Where's your ideal in those two places?
Well, it was that Kubrick film, wasn't it? How I stopped learning to worry about the bomb.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that's when you realize you got to get out, because the airport did seem a miraculous place to me. The more I knew about it, I knew what was behind the partition boards and behind the kind of screening and the subterranean corridors. It's an incredibly complex place. I just wanted to not lose sight of what you were trying to gently get at. I think was what I sometimes call the dark side of organization. Just as a curveball, and you may have heard this, but I doubt it, there's a very long tradition of thought in management studies which suggests that hierarchy and seniority, in fact, we have it the wrong way round. Society unconsciously dispels its sickest members up the chain of command. So the sickest members of society make it to the top. So if you haven't heard that, it will take quite a while to explain where it's coming from and how it achieves that result. But just as an intuitive kind of thought experiment, if you can go with that for a moment, you might think maybe those politicians that we kind of laugh at on TV and poke fun at, we may have done that, orchestrated that collectively as a society.
I think we have some wise research done by Mr. Douglas Adams that says if you want the job, you're the wrong person for the job. And hence a man in a shack on a tropical island is actually the galactic leader, because he's the most reliable person, because he doesn't even know he's the galactic leader. We'll leave that. I have one last...
Well, just on that, there is a thing called the Peter principle, which is the idea of people will seek promotion, and that an interesting question in its own right is why aren't people just happy doing the job that they do? But for whatever reason, we seek promotion, we seek advancement, and so the Peter principle is this idea that you promote to the point where you're no longer promotable, and therefore you hit a point in your career ladder when you're incompetent, because you've hit a point where you're not promotable anymore. So are those two things related? This idea that we're pushing people up all the time rather than celebrating excellence and saying, you're really good at what you do.
Yeah.
Why don't we pay you more based on your experience of being really good at what you do, without having to make you, the boss of everything? Because building things or programming software or whatever it is very different to managing people that build things or program software. And yet there's this sort of assumption in society.
Yeah. Maybe this is a legacy, Gareth, of the, what we think we might have escaped, which is this progress onwards, upwards, hope, linearity, hierarchy, moving on up. We still live by it. We still measure people by it. We still want people to compete for those kind of trajectories.
I can see we're going to ask you back, Damien, because there's just too many philosophical questions about this. Just that idea of, should every organization want to grow and be more successful? As there's a whole topic there. We're coming to the end just for today. And it's usually at this point that someone comes up with a rather asinine question, which is sort of the pop question. And frankly, I'm going to be no different today. So we've talked a lot, frankly, about the philosophy of leadership and management and the sort of different ways to think about it and different ways to engage it. But you worked at the airport. You were the ethnographer. You were part of the tribe. You looked and you learnt. You had all sorts of adventures around organizational structures. You're at a dinner party, and sitting opposite you is the next generation, a young, exciting leader of a business or public sector, and you've got them for 20 minutes, and they want to know, they're keen to learn, what frameworks or ideas would you want them to think about? What would you say? Okay, you're a new leader. I'm not going to give you the 10 great ways to be a leader, but here are the ideas I want you to think about. Which are the ideas you say, do me a favor, don't spend as much time on these?
Okay, so, I would work out what they were most comfortable with in the conversation, and I'd give them something that would make them uncomfortable. Now, that would be, different depending on who I was speaking to. Most of the time, I would find myself saying something like, oh, you should read Jane Austen on manners, taste, and etiquette, because to become a very senior executive competent member of this organization, they're not going to ask you to show off how many times you can calculate net present value. And I tell this to my, graduate students as well before they go for jobs. You can press a button to do that now. What they're going to want to know is, what kind of wine are you going to choose at dinner when we're trying to entertain a company that we're trying to do a deal with on a merger and acquisition? What wine would you order for filet mignon? Most of my students probably have a can of lager, mate.
And do you know what? I'm smiling. You always miss these when we do these recordings. Two things that I tell my team members. So, by the way, I should say, I'm quite senior in my organization, so I'm going to go to bed tonight thinking, am I the idiot in the organization? just to be clear. But I spend a lot of time telling my product managers, I work in the world of software, 75% of what you will need to know to be successful in your career has nothing to do with the skills of product management. The skills of product management, I can show you a book, you can read it, and you can go practice and become efficient. It is the equivalent of what wine would you pair with filet mignon that becomes valuable. That truly is important. And we haven't even talked about this tonight, but I think you've touched on this beautifully, which is, for me to be a successful leader, even though I am a product manager, and by definition, I can exhibit expertise in my area, there is an enormous amount of the equivalent of what wine would I pair with filet mignon. And I'll give you a real world example so it doesn't sound all wavy handy. Multiple times I have had to go for dinner with investors of various kinds. And to your point, I am auditioning myself as a leader for how I behave, which has nothing to do with my skills. And so I think that's such an interesting idea, that we all assume that leadership and management competence is about expertise. Problem is, that's probably about 25% of it. And it's things that we sometimes neither understand or even would wish to be true. I've met so many colleagues who say, I don't want to be senior because you do all of this nonsense. And I tried to say, no, you're missing the point. The nonsense enables me to go and do the things that I am competent at. It's my admission to the party, because if I can't pair the right wine with a filet mignon, they're not going to invest in the company. If they don't invest in the company, I don't get to build that software. So anyway,
well, you know what Hillary Clinton said? She and we haven't talked a lot about gender on this three men here, not talking about gender. But Hillary Clinton said, the most important thing in my life that got me where I am is my hair. Nobody at Wharton ever taught me that. Nobody in any of my expensive private schools taught me that. But it is the most important thing for a woman at work.
Damian, we're going to have to convince you somehow to come back on. we've spent the last 120, 30 episodes, and I get really worried every episode that it's almost, we end up being a blog post or a LinkedIn post where we say 10 ways to become a great leader. And it feels like we're describing, here are the 10 simple rules, and if you master them, you'll be great. Actually, it turns out, as we've just said, that's true, but actually it's these other things that are really difficult. Gareth, I apologize. Even though you've had jet lag, I've monopolized the conversation as I do when I get excited. Gareth, do you have any last questions of Damien before we call it a day?
I don't have any last questions. I think, just to echo your point there, we try and approach the topics of decision making, leadership, strategy from the commercial business world, from the military world, and as we said at the beginning, we compare and contrast them. I'm always struck that no matter how much we think we've covered these topics, there are other ways to look at them. And I think what's fascinating about what you've done, Damien, and it always is talking to you, is your approach to looking at the problem is so different to the kind of relatively stale now kind of business management, this is how you look at an organization. And it's not just interesting, it generates really useful insights and more importantly, more interesting questions that generates more discussion. So I agree completely with Chris. We're going to have to persuade you to come back on and talk more philosophically about some of the other challenges, such as decision making and strategy. And I think there's probably 2 more episodes there straight away.
I've got another one, which just to get it out of my head, otherwise we'll lose it, which is, Damien, we talked about Mary Parker Follett in a recent episode, it was a revelation to us that there was someone who 100 years ago, in fact, more than 100 years ago, was discussing things which we take for granted and think are very modern ideas. But at the end of the episode, something struck us, which was Mary was talking about a transition which arguably very few other people saw, this idea from a mechanistic to humanistic approach, perhaps is right to say. The point we made at the end of the podcast was, how are we going to spot the next transition? Because, of course, the risk is it's 30 years later, people tell us the transition happened and we missed it. And so we sort of threw out what could that mean? And the topic we came up with, which we really should do an episode on, but maybe we need to get you in on this, is what does this new world of AI mean?
Oh, yeah.
Because
in academia, it's, yeah.
And because I think the problem at the moment is, if we talk about AI, it is a theoretical based on tiny amounts of data. I wonder whether a more useful approach is a philosophical approach. Okay, I don't have any data, but let's think about what that could mean and think about it, as Gareth has said, in some radically different ways rather than traditional methods of saying, well, this is what it means today with a human being, this is what it means for AI. So anyway, maybe we can convince you to come back and we can have some fun thinking about what that means as well.
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, thank you, Damien. This is really good. Thank you, Gareth, because I know this is probably hour 48 in your day. Those of you who have enjoyed this, please do subscribe if you haven't done so already. We are available on X and Blue Sky, Battling with Biz with a Z. You can email us at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. And Damien, if people want to follow your work or read their book, where should they go? Or your book rather than their book. I don't care about their books. I care about your books.
I'm publicly available on the University of Liverpool website, and you can just search me up there. I run a Centre for Organisational and Employee Wellbeing. That's well publicised. I don't think people will have any problem finding me, as long as they spell my name right. There are other Dohertys.
We will make sure your name is spelt correctly in the podcast notes, so please do go find Damien as well. For the moment, though, Damien, thank you so much for joining us. And this is always the problem. I have a hangover after these kinds of conversations where for days after I'll be thinking, going, Oh, I have to go through this, but thank you. Really, really good, really exciting, and something a little bit different from what I think we normally do. Gareth, any last thoughts before we go?
I don't read enough classic novels.
We don't read enough classic
That's what I'm
novels.
taking away from this.
Excellent. On that bombshell, he said, stealing from a different genre of activity. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next time on Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. Cheerio.